Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a long way from Texas, but I'm very glad to be here to talk to you today. You recall that one of the themes of this conference, perhaps the main theme, is sustainable ecosystem services related to lakes. And in that regard, I wanted to make a few observations before we actually get into our panel discussion. I heard this morning, and I can't recall who said it, the simple statement that you probably heard many times: water is life. And I think it's probably very true. As far as I know, I've never heard of anybody that has found life of some kind possible without water. We can even survive without oxygen. We have bacteria that can exist in the bottoms of anaerobic lakes and so forth, but nothing can exist without water. In fact, our space agency and agencies around the world are spending billions of dollars to send spaceships to explore space, all hunting for signs of water. So it must be somewhat important. I think we'd agree. We certainly know it to be a major, I like to call it a major integrator of the impacts of human activities on the Earth's surface. It doesn't seem to matter where you put things, pollutants or otherwise. Ultimately, most of them are going to end up in a water body simply because of rainfall and gravity. That's just a reality that we can't escape. Well, we got too many papers and buttons. So I had to ask myself, who needs who? Do we need nature, or does nature need us? And I thought the answer was pretty obvious. Nature can get along quite fine without us, and would probably wish that we would all go away. And it would do just fine. I mean, life started in Africa, supposedly, but nature existed without us long before that ever happened. And against this background, we also have to talk about lentic waters. You've heard this expression. You're probably going to hear it more and more. Lentic waters are meant to be waters that are basically, I like to say, pooled or stored. They're in a lake, they're in a wetland, they're in a reservoir, or something like that, as opposed to water that flows, like in a river or a tributary. And lentic waters are, in fact, the type of water systems for which we get most of our ecosystem services. A huge range of them, I guess I should say. I don't want to downplay rivers, which move water. And we even go to the point of making lentic water systems. If we want hydropower, we build this concrete structure across a river and make a lake, make a lentic water system in order to produce it. Lake fisheries are better, any number of things. So we need deeper water for transportation, so we put in lakes. So we do use it for many, many more purposes. And that's something we have to consider within the context of sustainable ecosystem services. So if we want to talk about nature in a natural setting without humans, so to speak, or with minimal human presence and impacts, it has its own internal mechanisms for regeneration and its sustainability, feedback mechanisms. Elk may grow too much in an area. What does nature do? It steps in and makes half of them starve to death so that the remainder can exist on the grass. Or there's a prairie fire, I'm just using terrestrial examples, that burns the grass, and so they can't feed the elk, and the elk die, and there'll be fewer, it gives a chance for the grass to grow up. There are all sorts of internal mechanisms. One could give an entire easy course on this. And human activities can upset this natural equilibrium and disrupt this life-supporting ecosystem services. And I call it life-supporting because we can't get along without them. They provide for economic development, for well-being, and for those particular purposes. So we need to determine what we can do to help restore what we would consider the natural regeneration or repair capacities of nature. And as we will talk about with our group here, ILBM, Integrated Lake Basin Management, provides a means to address this goal. Now, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment put this new concept on the board for us. I guess I give them credit for it. Ecosystem services, the services that nature provides to us. And they put them in 4 categories. I don't know if many of you see this one. I like to call it the little television diagram. We have resource provision services. These are the ones where we get something. The nature provides us. In this case, we're talking about lakes. Lakes provide us with things. Hydropower, fisheries, transportation, things like this. We can make money on it if you want to look at it. We set up ministries to to govern these things. We also have regulating services. These are the services that underpin the provision. Nutrient recycling, drought and flood mitigation, just a few examples that I'm popping out. And lakes also have cultural services. They can mean things to different people in different parts of the world. They have some religious significance in many cases. And you need that service as well, and you need it. We have come to use that service. And it means something to us. You screw up a lake, you can screw up an important religious component, for example. And then supporting services. We do a little bit less there because this is sort of nature. Nature, we don't make soil, nature does. You know, we don't do geology, nature does, and so forth. Generally speaking, we can mess up the land surface, but that's the underpinning surface for all of this stuff. So the question is, we all want resource provision. We all want all the goodies that nature can provide, but we tend to forget these services, particularly the regulating services. This is something ILEC has been preaching for quite some time. We forget these regulating services. So, timely conservation is what we are going to gradually, what we'll need to gradually regain ecosystem service balances. We need to protect the regulating services. They will help improve the resource provision services and ultimately also the cultural and supporting services. I'm not kind of used to all these things moving around the screen, so they're new to me too. I've got to learn to do this. I'm an IT dinosaur. And another thing we have to consider is that lake basins consist usually, unless it's an endorheic, even an endorheic terminal lake basin, usually consist of some combination of lentic waters, standing waters, pool waters, stored waters, whichever you want to call them, and lodic water systems, flowing water systems, some combinations. So I say this because we've been talking about ILBM, Integrated Lake Basin Management, which we started, my gosh, a decade or so ago, maybe more than that. And you probably heard also listening ILLBM. What's that? What's ILBM and ILBM? Well, ILLBM is basically the next evolutionary link in the system, which consists, or which recognizes explicitly the facts that these lentic water bodies, I mean, a lake's just not a big hole in the ground. It has things going into it and things going out of it. And if we're going to manage the lake, we have to manage the whole system. And not only in and out on the surface by rivers and tributaries, but underwater as well. I mean, there's groundwater. In my university campus, we have a lake that is fed, actually, it was originally a groundwater spring that supplied huge quantities of groundwater, and two brothers wanted to put and then it flowed downhill, and the brothers wanted to make some sort of a bread factory for grains, and so they built a dam, and it made a lake to cover the groundwater inflow. And then that dam ended up being the headwaters for a river that flows to the campus as well. So on our campus we have a groundwater, lake, and river system. And when they talked about the lake, managing the lake system, they had to consider not only the lake basin, but where the groundwater came from, which was way outside the basin. So proper management would require them to consider things that aren't even in the basin directly. And as we say, ILBM is what we think is a tool. Dr. Alago has put a seventh pillar in here, cooperation. So we may have to build a new pagoda to go ahead and address that particular component as well. So, I guess my colleague there, Dr. Phillison, said, can we achieve all the SDGs and still maintain our lakes and our wetlands, which was a very good question. And in my own mind, it immediately said, because I consider ILBM and time does work. If we don't sustain our lakes and our wetlands, we won't achieve the SDGs. So that's a pretty good goal as well to consider. And so with that, we will be looking forward to our panel to help us go ahead and decide how we can help, if you will, nature restore its natural regeneration processes. Just what reminds me is that the very first principle in the World Lake Vision, which was produced by ILEC, is that we need to have a harmonious relationship between humans and lakes. And that's very consistent with this theme of sustainable ecosystem services. And with that, thank you, and we'll go to our panel now.